I'd like to thank the organizers of this meeting for inviting me. It's my second meeting, or time here. And as David Sweener says, this is really a totally unique conference for me. I normally talk only to scientists, and so it's a good opportunity to talk to people in general about the questions. Well, I'll just say that the topic of the potential harms and risks of nicotine is extremely complicated and nuanced, and I'm going to be giving you an overview and a summary in the beginning, and then I will provide some evidence. Undoubtedly, I'm not going to have time to go through the details of the various issues about the harms and risk of nicotine. Some of the slides I will not cover will be available on the website. I can just start out by saying that as Lynn mentioned, nicotine works in the cholinergic nervous system, which is present in every body organ, and therefore nicotine has effects on every body organ. Basic science studies will show potential harms on every body organ, and the problem is putting it into context. And the context is that in an attacked organism like a person, there's a homeostatic system where the body has got one effect and it's got a balancing out effect, and that leads to something which is generally beneficial for the person. And that homeostasis is not seen when you're doing studies in cells or in animal organs. And so that's the context in which we need to view the large literature on nicotine. But as you will see in a minute if the slides come up, there are effects of nicotine on virtually every body system. If the slides aren't available, I can get my notes and we can go through this lecture without the slides. Great, thank you so much. So here is a picture of the Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital, which is the main county hospital in San Francisco. The smoking prevalence in San Francisco, fortunately, is now well below 10%. It's probably 8% or 9%. But at the San Francisco General Hospital where I work, which takes care of the poorer people, the people with substance abuse and psychiatric problems, smoking prevalence is still 20 or 25%, which, as you all know, is where the major concerns are for cigarette smoking. These are my disclosures. Okay, so the background and the question that I've been asked to address is, the background is that the harms and risks of nicotine are an essential consideration in assessing the public health impact of nicotine-based harm reduction. And the question I was asked is, what do we know about the safety of long-term use of nicotine delivered without tobacco combustion? So let me just say right now, we have no evidence of nicotine in an inhaled route, which is a key question. We have a lot of literature on snus, and by and large, snus has been shown to be not very harmful. That may or may not extrapolate totally to inhaled nicotine, and we will not know until we have people using inhaled nicotine for a long period of time. The clinical concern, so I practice cardiovascular disease, and so the questions come up. If I have a vapor who has switched from cigarette smoking and is now vaping, should I counsel that person to quit vaping? And are there some high-risk morbidities, for example, cardiovascular disease, that warrants stopping nicotine sooner rather than later? So this is a clinical question that I've got to address. A second question, which comes up in the public health policy, is, are there health concerns for primary nicotine addiction in never smokers? And we see this with the whole question about youth using e-cigarettes in the US. What if they became addicted? What are the health risks of that? So in brief summary, and I've already said some of this, so nicotine has effects on every part of the body, and basic research has shown many potential harms. Long-term nicotine use, I think most people would acknowledge, is not harmless, but much less harmful than cigarette smoking. So there's no question that nicotine, if it helps people quit smoking, is beneficial. The harms of long-term inhalation of nicotine without tobacco combustion have not been determined. And one of the things I hope my talk will suggest is the areas where we need to do epidemiology to try to figure out, are there risks? And the last point is something I won't talk about, but I think is important, because this comes up a lot, is the acceptability of nicotine addiction per se in non-smokers. Is it a health question? Well, we don't know that yet. And the other thing is, should we be accepting the fact that kids who never smoke cigarettes and don't want to smoke cigarettes become addicted to nicotine? So what if nicotine is harmless? There are still questions of compulsive use. There's questions of financial cost. These are questions that are not really scientific, and I won't address them. But these are important questions that I'm asked a lot about that you need to consider. So as Lynn said, nicotine is a chemical that is shaped like acetylcholine, and therefore it works on acetylcholine receptors throughout the body. Like most psychoactive drugs, it mimics an endogenous biological system. The main pharmacologic effects of nicotine are shown here. The first one, most important one for addiction, is it facilitates neurotransmitter release of many neurotransmitters, especially dopamine, which signals pleasure. So this, of course, is essential for addiction. The sympathetic neural stimulation, which Lynn talked about, that's both psychological stimulation and also stimulation of, say, the cardiovascular system, and also many other sympathetic systems that may play a role in cardiovascular disease and even cancer. The cholinergic nervous system has immune modulating functions. This is the normal system. And so nicotine actually in itself is an immunosuppressant, so it reduces immune response. So in animal models, we have an immune disease. So there's an immune myocarditis, inflammation of the heart. There are other immune diseases, some sepsis syndromes in animals, where the death is caused by an excessive immune response. Nicotine is protective against that. By the same token, nicotine, and if I have time, I'll show you slides later, but nicotine in infection, say an influenza infection in mice, if you give mice, expose them to an e-cigarette, say PGVG alone and PGVG with nicotine, the mice who are exposed to PGVG with nicotine have greater viral exposure and greater death. So it's clear in animal models that nicotine immune suppressant effects could increase the risk of infection, a serious infection. And this is one area of human epidemiology which needs to be studied because we just don't know. There's effects on oxidant stress. We know oxidant stress is bad. It damages cells. Nicotine, of course, is much less of an oxidant stress than cigarette smoke, but whether it causes some injury itself is not clear. The endothelium, or the lining of the blood vessels that are involved for blood vessel health, they dilate blood vessels, they reduce blood clotting in blood vessels, and nicotine can impair these things in isolated systems. The last two relate to cancer. So while we have no evidence that nicotine increases cancer with snus, there are two effects of nicotine that have been of concern. One is a phenomenon of apoptosis. That's cell death that occurs, say, if you have a cancer cell and you give it a cancer chemotherapeutic drug and the cell dies, or you give it radiation and the cell dies. Basically, you're activating this apoptosis response. Well, nicotine inhibits apoptosis. And so in animal models, it reduces the response of experimental cancers to chemotherapy or radiotherapy. Promotes cell growth, including angiogenesis. So angiogenesis is generation of new blood vessels, and that's involved in the metastases of cancer. And again, in animal studies, nicotine can promote the metastasis of cancer. So we have a lot of concerns that come out about nicotine effects, again, reflecting the fact that nicotine is acting on the cholinergic nervous system, which modulates a lot of body functions. So this is my sort of overview slide of the specific safety concerns for nicotine. And the basis for this rating is a combination of biological plausibility and animal studies, snus data, and my own intuition. So that's where this comes from. So addiction, definitely nicotine plays a role. I would say for cardiovascular disease and reproductive toxicity, there's a probable role. And I think I'll have time to talk about those too. Impaired adolescent brain development is possible. Infectious disease is possible for the reasons I already talked about. Cancer is possible. Let me just say a word about cancer because I won't talk about that later. Again, one of the effects of cigarette smoking is sympathetic neural activation. And it turns out that there's a lot of data accumulating that blocking the sympathetic nervous system response can actually improve outcomes in certain cancers. So the sympathetic nervous system seems to play a role in cancer. And so there's a significant biological plausibility that by that mechanism alone even, that nicotine could play a role. And chronic lung disease I have here because there is one animal model that suggests that nicotine can produce chronic lung disease changes in rodents. Again, I don't think that's likely, but needs to be on the horizon. So addiction, I want to make a few points about addiction because I think this is interesting. The one thing about non-combusted tobacco is that nicotine is not the only thing that causes addiction. So the thing that's been talked about mostly is this enzyme called monoamine oxidase in the brain, which breaks down dopamine and other catecholamines. And cigarette smoke contains substances, not nicotine, that inhibit monoamine oxidase. And when you inhibit monoamine oxidase, when you give nicotine, then you get more catecholamine response, more dopamine, and animals will learn to self-administer nicotine at a much lower threshold when you block monoamine oxidase. So intrinsically, the combination of blocking monoamine oxidase from cigarette smoke and nicotine would make cigarettes more addictive than e-cigarettes. So that's an important concept. Speed of nicotine delivery is important, and also the amount of nicotine. I'll get to that in a second. And the pattern of nicotine dosing and the potential for addiction varies by device. And this is something I wanted to bring up. You saw data yesterday, if you were here, or you've seen it, with standardized puffing sessions for e-cigarettes, say 10 puffs or 15 puffs over 10 minutes, for cigarettes compared to e-cigarettes, and the profiles look the same. But that's not how people use e-cigarettes versus cigarettes. People use e-cigarettes not 10 puffs in 10 minutes, but they usually space it out much more in smaller clusters throughout the day. And the 10 puffs in 10 seconds gives a very big spike of nicotine and potentially more addictive response. So that's still a question about whether the different patterns, what the influence of different patterns of use is on addiction. This is a nicotine addiction cycle. Lynn talked about this. The concept is you smoke a cigarette, you get rapid nicotine absorption, you get arousal, you get mood modulation, you get pleasure. And then within the day, you start to develop tolerance even, and physical dependence, which means you have withdrawal symptoms. And then you get the craving for nicotine, and you self-medicate withdrawal symptoms. The reason I want to bring this up is not just to talk about this cycle, but also to say that if you're not constrained, people tend to titrate their mood and their affect and take in the same amount of nicotine from day to day. So the concept of titration is important. Now, again, I mentioned snus and e-cigarettes in terms of nicotine. What do we know about nicotine exposure? Well, Swedish snus users and former smokers who use e-cigarettes have similar cotinine levels to typical cigarette smokers. So nicotine intake seems to be the same across products. In experimental switching studies, e-cigarette users achieve similar nicotine intake to when smoking cigarettes. Again, titration. And there is titration of nicotine intake across products. And I'll show you some data about that. But that's a slide which I think is really interesting. There's a study that we did, and it's currently under review, where we looked at dual users, cigarettes and e-cigarettes. And in this study, there were 3 people who used Juul. And we put them on a research ward and let them ad libitum either smoke the cigarettes or use Juul different days. And then we measure nicotine levels every 4 hours. Because we want to know what does titration look like in a real natural environment, not when you give them experimental cigarettes to experimental paradigm. And what's interesting here is that when using Juul or using a cigarette, the nicotine levels were pretty much matched throughout the day. Even the pattern is the same. So some people use more in the morning, both Juul and cigarettes, and some people use more nicotine in the afternoon, both Juul and cigarettes. So the pattern really matches well. What you don't see here, though, is the difference in terms of the spikes. So if we were to track every cigarette, when you smoke a cigarette, you have to take your 8 or 9 puffs because the cigarette's burning out. So you're getting much bigger spikes of nicotine from the cigarettes, which we don't capture in this kind of study. So even though there's pretty good titration throughout the day, there still could be different addiction potential depending on how nicotine is being used. In terms of products, so I just give examples. The top 2 are from Wagner's research in Oklahoma, looking at pretty heavy smokers and who would switch to vaping. And cotinine level is a marker of daily intake. And basically, they found pretty high levels, certainly comparable to smoking or higher than most smokers. At the bottom are some data we have from dual adult users and showing a cotinine level of 172 nanograms per ml is exactly the same as the average cotinine level in cigarette smokers in the US. So one, it's pretty clear that regular e-cigarette users can take the same amount of nicotine as smokers. But 2, you can also see that the nicotine content of the liquid, which varies from 4 milligrams with a mod versus 59 from Juul, doesn't predict nicotine intake at all, because people are really using nicotine as they need to experience what they want to experience from their e-cigarettes. So we talked a little bit about cardiovascular safety. So there are a lot of toxicants in cigarette smoke that cause cardiovascular disease, which are kind of summarized here. And most of them, the oxidants are thought to be most important. Volatile organic compounds, also extremely important. And those are present in much higher concentrations in cigarette smoke than e-cigarettes. Carbon monoxide is not present in e-cigarettes at all. And so nicotine is the one that is certainly common in terms of the amount of delivery for both. So the first thing, again, the sympathetic nervous system or hemodynamic effects of nicotine, this is well established. And these are data from various studies we've done over time. First, in general, nicotine increases heart rate and blood pressure, increases the contraction of the heart and the work of the heart. It can constrict blood vessels, including coronary blood vessels. It can reduce coronary blood reserve, which means if you have a blockage, you don't respond to it as well. It can constrict blood vessels in the skin and can also dilate blood vessels in the skeletal muscle. And so this slide basically shows on the top, this looks at cigarette smoking, oral snuff, chewing tobacco, and nicotine gum. And every one of them increases heart rate on average 20 beats a minute after overnight abstinence, an average of 7 beats a minute throughout the day. Also increases systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. So this is something every nicotine product does. And maybe it's not necessarily good if your heart rate and blood pressure is elevated. Here's some data from, again, this crossover study. This involves 36 people that we studied where they were dual users, and again, we put them on the research ward, and they could either use their e-cigarettes or their regular cigarettes for periods of time, and we monitor heart rate throughout the day. So this is a measure of throughout the day sympathetic nervous system stimulation. And you can see the red line is tobacco smoking, so heart rate increases, and it averages about 7 beats a minute over 24 hours higher than non-smoking, which is in the green, and e-cigarette is the blue in the middle. So the point here is that cigarette smoking causes a substantial increase in sympathetic activity, and if you use heart rate as the surrogate, then e-cigarettes cause moderate increase, not none. So that's a significant effect, but less than cigarette smoking. 2 minutes, okay. So let me just say, for the snus issue, which is the only form of nicotine that we've studied without combustion, well, we know there's the same daily nicotine exposure. If we look at non-invasive markers of atherosclerosis, like the thickness of the carotid blood vessel, there's no effect. Case control studies show no increase in the risk of heart attack or stroke, but a small increase in fatality. And then there's this one study that I've shown here from Arafalk, which is concerning. This was a study looking at people who had heart attacks and then following them for a couple of years afterwards and looking at mortality and looking at the people who quit snus use and continued snus use and showed a double mortality if you continued snus use. Now again, there's some confounders here, but this raises the question about whether in someone who's got heart disease there is a risk of nicotine per se. So I think I'm going to skip the rest of this, and I'm glad to answer any questions about the adolescent brain or infection or cancer, but let me just get to my conclusions. So the first one is that nicotine can potentially affect every organ system in the body. Various potential harmful effects and mechanisms are suggested by studies of nicotine in cells and animals. Addiction is expected with regular use of nicotine, but its health consequences are determined primarily by its delivery system, i.e. cigarette smoking being the worst. Nicotine is much less hazardous to cardiovascular health than smoking, but may contribute to acute cardiovascular events, particularly in the presence of cardiovascular disease. Nicotine is a reproductive hazard. I didn't show data here, but there's clear evidence that nicotine from snus increases the risk of low birth weight, of prematurity, of stillbirth, and preeclampsia. So I would say nicotine is a reproductive hazard and should be avoided during pregnancy unless it's used to support smoking cessation, which is even worse. There's a biological plausibility for nicotine to enhance infectious disease, to promote cancer, and contribute to chronic lung disease, but the risk is likely low based on the safety record of Swedish snus. And finally, because users titrate nicotine dose to desired effects, regulatory standards based on nicotine levels in non-combusted products is complicated. Higher nicotine products are likely to be safer with respect to exposure to other chemicals because the higher the nicotine concentration, if you titrate, the less other aerosol components you get exposed to. However, they may also be more addictive to adolescent non-smokers, which is sort of the double sword, because if someone, the kid is using e-cigarettes just to experiment, and they're not seeking nicotine in the beginning, but they get exposed to more nicotine and they can tolerate that, then it's likely to accelerate the development of addiction. So let me stop at that point, and again, there are lots of details. If someone has questions about the details, I'll handle those in the questions.